So I know last time we started speaking about how to confront blank space, how to start writing in general, and I wanted to continue on that theme, though this time there's going to be some ideas of prompts, but there's also going to be sort of guidelines or rules to sort of help keep you writing instead of stopping or finding reasons to stop. And the first thing is first, which is to allow yourself to keep writing the same thing over and over, to obsess. In some ways, obsession itself is the basis of art. There's no real reason to explore something if you're not really obsessed with it, if you're not really concerned or interested or have some strong emotion towards it. And really the basis of that is obsession, right? Whatever you care about, you obsess over. And while it might not be healthy in interpersonal relationships, when it comes to creative writing, it actually can be very good. And part of that is also creating drafts. So oftentimes people will write something, especially on a technology of some kind, computer, tablet, phone, right? And you continue writing it over and over, but you delete things and you take them out of circulation, right? So you don't remember what you've done in the past. You can't recall, it doesn't exist anywhere. And one of the nice things that I discovered during graduate school is to keep your drafts. In some way, it's a check on yourself, right? Did you do this before? Have you seen this before? Is it new? Is it different? But also, throughout time, you see sort of how you improve it, and you can sort of study yourself as an outsider. Maybe even 6 months, a year later, you'll go back to something that wasn't working. You'll see, oh, what was I thinking? How was I doing it? Why wasn't it working? Maybe even earlier drafts are better, right? Sometimes a line from the first draft will help your 10th draft, and you just sort of lost something in the middle, and it comes back to you. And so that'll help you keep writing. If you don't think of erasure at all, you kind of, okay, this is one draft, and I move to the next one. And you can even take lines from the first draft and move them forward, but don't be afraid to keep what you've written and continue on. Another part of writing is getting in the mind space, creating that physical and mental space to be able to write. And that looks very different for a lot of people. Some people it's going to an open field. Some people it's hunkering down at a desk in a very small room. It's really up to you how you do that, but it is important to sort of, if you're going to sit down for a real session, let's call it, you go and you set up the space, right? Like a session musician goes to a studio, right? The studio is set up with specific kinds of walls and mics, and the instruments are in certain places, and their headphones, and everything's sort of conducive to the idea of music. And so too with writing, right? You want to have a space that could be both mental and physical, where writing flows. And sometimes, things hit you, and all of a sudden you enter that space even unanticipated. But in general, you want to think about how can you create the best space in order to write. Part of creating that space is lessening distraction. Obviously, it's easy nowadays to get distracted, right? There's phones, there's watches, there's infinite things that can distract you. And maybe shutting down the things for 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever it is, right? Just allowing yourself to enter sort of a state of, I can't be contacted, I can't be bothered, I can't be interrupted. It might seem daunting to kind of disconnect yourself, but in some ways it's back to our idea from the previous video where we're talking about setting up prompts or rules or regulations, right? That oftentimes we think of rules as confining, as they're limiting us, but really one good rule or two good rules or confined space really allows our brain to feel safe and move forward, right? It distracts the brain from infinite possibilities and focuses it forward on one possibility. Those rules can actually be freeing in very many ways. And oftentimes when you're struggling using a form or using an imposed rule, stolen from a form, or just something you're obsessing over, right? I'm obsessed with the way something sounds or the way something feels or the way something tastes, right? The sensory sort of input that we have, if you focus on that, you can move it forward and start writing on that thing and just go on that idea or feeling. Oftentimes also what keeps us sort of away from writing is that we're afraid we're slipping into somebody else's voice or even a voice that we put on when we're quote unquote being an artist, right? Oftentimes I remember I had a critique from Mary Ruffle once where she said, oh, this poem could be good, but you're trying to sound like a poet. Don't try and sound like a poet, try and write. And that was a really good critique where it was sort of like you have this idea in your head of what a poet or a writer is supposed to sound like, how things are written, right? And it can be from reading excellent writers, excellent craftsmen or craftswomen who work on these things, and you sort of adopt their voices and try and mimic and imitate. And in many ways, that's a good way to start. It might even be a good prompt, right? Mimic this person's poem, mimic that person's story, mimic the style, mimic the voice, mimic whatever that person is doing. However, part of that process of getting to your own work is actually to stop mimicking, and to stop mimicking not only other people, but also this idea of yourself. And just to allow the moment to take over and to be there and to write on that moment, in that moment, without thinking about the voice or trying to imitate something you think you should be imitating. Just to allow the authentic experience to translate through the words. Similarly, avoiding cliche is really important, right? Oftentimes we sort of allow cliches to take the place of new and exciting language. We sort of fall into these ruts of other people, right? Of other language, of language that's not really ours. And oftentimes what we're trying to accomplish in poetry and in writing is to build something that's ours, right? That comes from us. The cliches are the exact opposite. They are cliches for a reason, right? They do capture an idea, but it's used so many times, obviously, that it becomes not interesting anymore, that people get to space out or lose interest in what you're doing because you're just not doing it, right? You are using somebody else's or the world's words instead of your own. And really, right, at the end of the day, all of this is entertainment. Writing is entertainment. And so if you're not entertaining the audience, then you're not doing what you're supposed to. And, you know, in some ways people think nowadays perhaps that you're trying to entertain yourself, that you're trying to create art for yourself. But really you're trying to entertain yourself also, right? You're trying to keep yourself engaged, that obsession, that sort of forward motion. And so that kind of leads us to the next point, which is also not to think of yourself as the protagonist. This was a big psychological shift that I had to make, right? Poems have speakers, stories have protagonists, and those are not you. What happens, even if you are basing the entire thing off exactly what happened to you, just remember, you're only one perspective of the story, right? If something happens, that means there's at least two perspectives, if not infinite perspectives, on what occurred. And so you want to think of the person or thing or place in the story as outside of you, as something else. And that allows distance, because in many ways, people, and I know I'm one person like this, I find it very hard to talk about myself, to compliment myself, to make myself sound good necessarily, right? In many ways, that tortured artist thing is a cliche, but sometimes it's true, and people find themselves torturing themselves, or they don't think highly of themselves, or whatever it is, whatever psychological impediment is keeping you from going, you want to remove yourself from that, right? It's not you, it's the speaker, it's the protagonist, it's whoever, it's the antagonist, whatever you're trying to encapsulate about yourself or the character that you're dealing with or the idea that you're dealing with, right? Don't allow it to become part of you. This is art that is outside of you. And the second you cross that barrier, it becomes much harder to write, because you're sort of writing yourself, and your own worth and your own experience is tied up in the art in a way that stifles creativity or stifles chances or stifles ideas, because you're worried, again, what we were talking about in the last video, about how people will perceive this. And oftentimes readers don't understand that, and that does create conflict, right? Where somebody will write something controversial, let's say, and all of a sudden people are like, how could you do this? And the point is, you're exploring something within the art, and it's not necessarily reflective of who you are or what you believe or even what you think or even something you're interested in. It just is something you're exploring. And so we have to remind ourselves as artists not to take that kind of thing personally, but to allow the space between you and the work. And when you do that, it will help you write. Finally, something to focus on is telling the truth. I remember in Marie Howe's class, she often would make a very large distinction between hyperbole and truth. And while there is place for hyperbole, oftentimes people will make up facts, or not even facts, but like impossible scenarios that don't make any sense. And they're trying to take artistic license, they're trying to create sort of anachronisms or even anecdotes, right, that connect different ideas. And so there is benefit to that, right? You want to keep your mind open, and you want to keep your sort of creative juices flowing, for lack of a better term, to use a cliche. But when you're editing back, you really want to think about, can this possibly happen, right? Somehow a human is bending his foot up while also bending the toes backwards and balancing perfectly on the top of his toes on the other foot. It's like impossible, right? And while it might sort of be used as a metaphor for lack of balance, in many ways you want to keep the poem grounded, you want to keep the poem real, you want to keep the poem translatable to other people. And in some ways, when you create these images that are not realistic, you're actually drawing the reader out, because they have to think about it, they have to do the logistics in their head, they have to do the math while they're reading, and that draws them away from what you're trying to accomplish with language. And again, what we're trying to do many of the times while we're writing is to keep the reader engaged and to keep the reader moving forward and interested. And oftentimes, if you allow for the reader to have confusion or to sort of have to do math in their head, all of a sudden you've drawn them away from the art, you've drawn them away from the experience, and you've created a much more, not an emotional or experiential thing, you've created a logical or mental sort of game that they have to puzzle out. And that's not really, there is puzzling to be done over a theme or a concept. And sometimes you want to be obscure, and sometimes there are reasons to do that. But overall, you're not trying to create obscurity for obscurity's sake, right? You're not trying to confuse the reader. You're trying to lead the reader somewhere, inform the reader, build some sort of experience. So now that we've sort of gone through these ideas about how to keep writing, how to sort of format yourself, prompts are a good thing. So as we're talking about using real facts, we're going to steal that prompt from Marie Howe, and we're going to say, write a poem using only literal descriptions. And for fiction and creative nonfiction, the prompt is going to be, create a third-person version of yourself. So they have your name, they have your background, but they are not you. Pick one detail and make it different from your life. Pick a situation that you've experienced and put that character that is very similar to you, but again, not you, and write that story. Hopefully you guys will submit that, and I'm happy to read them as they come in. I'll see you next time.